When it comes to freedom of will, Frankl said that even in the concentration camps, when a person suffers inescapable suffering, like being sent to the ovens, being sent to the crematoria, in spite of that, there is a level of freedom that they have. My name is Rabbi Daniel Schoenbach. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist.
And we're here to talk about your book that you wrote, Viktor Frankl and the Psychology of the Soul.
Viktor Frankl is known most commonly from his most famous book called Man's Search for Meaning, which has sold millions of copies. It's translated into over 25 languages. And it also is one of the most important books of the 20th century. So I write a lot in my book, Viktor Frankl and the Psychology of the Soul, about Man's Search for Meaning. Man's Search for Meaning, the first half, talks about his experience in the camps. The second part talks about logotherapy, which is Viktor Frankl's psychology. Logotherapy means the psychology of meaning.
He started off as somewhat of a student to an extent of Freudian thought, if I understand correctly, but ultimately pivoted to a different direction.
Yeah, he really did. You see, Sigmund Freud talked a lot about the self. He talked about something called the id. Now, some people have said the id is really the nefesh Bahamis, or the animal soul, or the negative inclination called the Yetzer Hara. But what Sigmund Freud didn't talk about is the godly soul. Frankl was very bothered by this. In fact, he wrote another book called The Unconscious God, where he says really the man's essential drive is for God. And unlike the id of Sigmund Freud, he says we have something called the religio, a will towards God, an unconscious level of will, which we need to manifest in our lives, but it's the driving force in human behavior. Now, I as a therapist look for the religio in my clients. Sigmund Freud would look for the expression of the id. I look for spiritual inclinations. I'm looking for spiritual resources in my clients. This is a very different perspective on psychotherapy than most people that were trained in Sigmund Freud or even CBT for that matter.
How you got to this point where it's like, I have to take this well-known idea and show how it's so much weaved and a part of Chassidus and Chassidic thought and the like.
I began the process of exploring Viktor Frankl's ideas more seriously and promoting them when I started reading about the Logotherapy Rebbe's connection to Viktor Frankl. The Rebbe referenced Frankl in at least 3 places I read online in the 1950s and 2 in the 1960s. The Rebbe was very supportive of Frankl's ideas. In fact, he sent somebody to speak to Frankl, to give him chizuk, to encourage him to continue his work, in spite of the fact that most of the world of psychology ignored Viktor Frankl, told him to keep on pushing on, moving forward. And 2 is he referred many people to Viktor Frankl's writings on meaning, because I believe there is a connection between psychology and Chassidus, and Viktor Frankl is the bridge between those 2 worlds. Viktor Frankl also talked about going beyond the self and accessing higher levels of meaning. In fact, he called the relationship with God finding ultimate meaning in life. Frankl uniquely talked about that. Sigmund Freud rejected God. He believed that God was a made-up figment of the imagination to protect oneself against the dangers of the world. Sigmund Freud was really quite wrong. Frankl said God and the relationship with God is a unique human phenomenon. We have to really respect that phenomenon. Now, Chassidus ultimately talks about God and our relationship with God. And it talks about God in different ways. If you look at my top 4 levels of meaning, the top 2 levels are both spirituality and God himself. So some people can relate to God on a spiritual, religious level, religious practice. But Chassidus enlightens the highest level, which is what we call Chelek Elokai Mimal Mamish, that a person is a piece of God from above. That's a remarkable psychological revelation as well. A person is really ultimately good and connected to God. In spite of what they've been through, in spite of their traumas, in spite of their cognitions, in spite of their drives, they are not their depression. They are not their anxiety. They're a person who may have depression or anxiety, but ultimately they're a person who's intimately connected with God. When you help people realize that, they expand their awareness of themselves. It's beyond themselves. If you look at my chart of 10 levels of meaning, the first 6 levels are about the self. Most of psychology focuses on the self. Our traumas, our childhood, our cognitions, they don't focus beyond the self. But when you get to working with people to find those spiritual and emotional resources, like things they find meaningful, things they find values, virtues, you focus on their spirituality, and you focus on their unique relationship with God, they start feeling these tremendous sensations. They have this new awareness, which gives them even levels of ecstasy and joy they can experience. And those are the emotions necessary to curing illnesses like depression and anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder. Viktor Frankl claimed that the lower you get in life, the higher you have to reach. In fact, he uses a beautiful muscle or metaphor that a person can't reach behind their back and pick themselves up. They need something higher than themselves, like a rope or an idea or God himself to pick you out of where you're at in life. So I was very inspired by the stories I've been reading and watching on YouTube of Yitzi Horowitz. Yitzi Horowitz was struck with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. At this point, he can't move, and he writes Torah with his eyes. And I watched some beautiful videos of him speaking through this computer, through his eyes, and his wife speaking as well, Dina. And I believe that Yitzi Horowitz is accessing what I call the highest level on that chart of meaning, the highest level of God. He wrote a beautiful story where he says there was one day where his machine didn't work. He couldn't write with his eyes. And Dina's wife said to him, it doesn't matter because on Shabbos, you don't write with your eyes either. You matter. You matter to us. If you're alive, that's what matters to God. That's what matters to us. As I got more deeply into Viktor Frankl's writings, his psychology, and his philosophy, he talked about two important things which showed me that there's a connection with Hasidic thought. Frankl talked about something called hyper-reflection and hyper-intention. Hyper-reflection is when a person focuses too much on the self. Paradoxically, most of psychotherapy focuses on the self. People go to a psychotherapist, they talk about themselves, they talk about their pain, they talk about their feelings, they talk about their traumas, they talk about their childhood. Frankl says paradoxically or ironically, somebody could speak too much about themselves. So therapy might not really help them. Frankl didn't want to remove psychotherapy or reduce it. He wanted to, what he says, complete psychotherapy. There's another side. So hyper-reflection has to be replaced, according to Frankl, with going beyond the self. He called it de-reflecting, reflecting away from the self. And the second he called hyper-intentionality, wanting something too much. Frankl had a great line where he says, happiness cannot be pursued, it must ensue. You can't wake up in the morning and say, I want to be happy, I want to be happy. It's not going to happen. Rather, you have to focus on, I want to fulfill some meaning in my life, something valuable, whether it's an experience, whether it's loving someone, according to Frankl, experiencing something. When I do that, happiness will follow me. The Mittler Rebbe also talks about this in Kuntras's Bailis, also known as attract and ecstasy. He says that one of the dangers of meditation is that a person could think too much about themselves. So he claimed that a person could be wanting to get close to God, but experience too much of himself, like I want to become spiritual, yet feel more of himself. So he says you have to meditate beyond the self to lose the self.
What are some of the ways, let's get a little into more practical aspects of things, of how you'd go about with someone who's struggling to now change their mindset, weave the two together, and allow them to grow?
So on top of the standard psychotherapy I do with my client, I also ask them to find things that are meaningful, to discover what's meaningful. Somebody might find studying a new hobby is meaningful, learning a new language, studying Torah, going on a trip, going to see the Grand Canyon or stand by the Western Wall. I have them choose from a menu of meaningful experiences, and for 30 days, every day journal, have they fulfilled their levels of meaning? Have they fulfilled their values in their life? And when they start doing that, I predict after 30 days, they're going to find a transformation that's beyond themselves. Because when they're focusing just on themselves, they're limited. As they do the psychotherapy, also focus on fulfilling values and meaning, and a spiritual transformation will take place to really cure their depression and anxiety. Viktor Frankl experienced that in the concentration camps as well. He had to go beyond himself. There's two big stories about this. One is he was on a death march. We know that when you're on a death march, if you fall or falter for 1 minute, you'll be shot by the Nazis. So Frankl had to keep going on. So he imagined himself beyond himself, surviving this experience, really not knowing if he would, but then teaching about the psychology of the concentration camps to his followers. That was remarkable. He had to imagine himself fulfilling a meaning in the future, which helped him survive that death march. Another tremendous story is he got something called typhus in the camps, which was spread by lice. And he knew that if he would fall asleep with 104 fever that night, he would die. So what he did instead is he grabbed a few pieces of paper and he started rewriting a book on these scraps of paper, a book that was taken from him called The Doctor and the Soul. And the will to meaning, he had that meaning to write down his book that the Nazis stole from him and burnt in Auschwitz. The very act of rewriting his book kept him alive that night. So he kind of proved practically that in order to overcome depression and anxiety, in order to have meaning in our lives, we have to ascribe to certain values and fulfill certain meanings, Viktor Frankl said that those believed that they would fulfill a future meaning in their lives were most apt to survive Auschwitz. What that means on a practical level is we want to overcome what we're going through. If we're facing inescapable suffering, we all know that depression and anxiety are also sometimes states of inescapable suffering. If we want to overcome them, we have to fulfill some meaning in our lives, not just focus on ourselves. When we fulfill a meaning, then we're most apt to survive our depression and anxiety as well. So in spite of what we're going through, in spite of my feelings of depression and anxiety, I still squeeze out, I push myself, because we have freedom of will as well. I push myself, I squeeze out life, and I push myself to fulfill a meaning. I'm most apt to survive and overcome my depression and anxiety as well.
You just mentioned the freedom of will, Bechiras Chafshis, which you mentioned as well in the book, and bring that out. Do you mind just explaining that a little bit with regards to then applying this way of life and how we work with different struggles and challenges?
Yeah, there are three main concepts in logotherapy: freedom of will to meaning, and the meaning of life. When it comes to freedom of will, Frankl said that even in the concentration camps, when a person suffers inescapable suffering, like being sent to the ovens, being sent to the crematoria, in spite of that, there is a level of freedom that they have, and it's the freedom to choose one's attitude towards their suffering. So even in Auschwitz, a person would be confronted with the gas chambers. They could also, even in the death camps, they could also choose their values and understand that they were dying, B'kiddush Hashem, as Frankl says in Hebrew, the Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, Hear Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one.
Did your own personal experiences or stories from clients help shape the ideas in this book? And do you have one you could share?
Very, very much so. I started seeing that if I spoke too much to my clients who had depression or post-traumatic stress disorder, they really weren't getting better. Then I started shifting to logotherapy, where I also started seeing when I focused on meaning and values with my clients, they started getting much better. So I started realizing that as I focused on meaning and values, if they're getting better, it meant that I was focusing too much on themselves. I started seeing a tremendous shift in my clients at that point. Therefore, I started seeing the value of Viktor Frankl's writings and why the Rebbe wanted people to focus on fulfilling meaning and values as well. On a personal level, I had to overcome the tragedy which befell my family as a child when my father was in a terrible car accident. I had to find meaning in my life as a young child in spite of what my family was going through. And at the time, I started reading Viktor Frankl, and I found his teachings very inspirational. And I saw many years later as a psychotherapist the power of Frankl when I worked with his ideas with my clients as well.
Is there a specific moment or concept from the book that you think will really hit home for readers? If there's one message to take away, one specific idea that, if their headspace is only available for one idea to drill it home, I guess what would that be?
The main idea is pick something that's meaningful and do it, or live by your value system. When you pick those things, that will change your life more easily than even psychotherapy.
The Rohr Jewish Learning Institute has the largest collection of Jewish media online. Hit subscribe for more.